The digital thermometer on my desk read 38 degrees Fahrenheit as I typed up another formal maintenance request on my laptop. My fingers stiff with cold despite wearing gloves indoors. Outside my bedroom window, icicles hung from the broken gutter that Frank had ignored for 8 months. And inside, my breath was visible in the frigid air that passed for adequate heating in his building. My name is Sophie, I'm 27, and I just learned that some landlords mistake desperation for powerlessness. This is the story of how I discovered that tenant rights are only as strong as your willingness to enforce them. My phone buzzed with a text from Frank. Stop complaining about heat. Building is fine. Pay rent on time or find somewhere else. The dismissive response was typical of his management style, nor legitimate maintenance requests. Blame tenants for problems he'd created, and threaten eviction whenever anyone demanded basic habitability standards. What Frank didn't understand was that his pattern of neglect had created a comprehensive legal case that would soon transform his comfortable life as a slumlord. I pulled up the documentation folder on my computer, now containing over 40 photos of code violations, 16 recorded conversations with Frank refusing repairs, copies of rent payments made despite uninhabitable conditions, and temperature logs showing that my apartment had been below legal minimum heating requirements for 93 consecutive days. My landline rang with a call from my colleague at the housing authority. Sophie, we received your complaint about 412 Maple Street. The inspection is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Will Frank be notified in advance? I asked. Property owners receive 24-hour notice for routine inspections, she replied. But given the severity of violations you've documented, this will likely result in immediate citations and potential legal action. The housing inspection would mark the beginning of Frank's education about landlord responsibilities and tenant rights. But what he didn't know was that the inspection would be conducted by someone with a very personal interest in ensuring proper enforcement of housing codes. The next morning, I watched from my frozen apartment as Frank hurried around the building, attempting last-minute repairs before the housing inspector arrived. The same repairs he'd been refusing to make for months, suddenly urgent now that official scrutiny was imminent. Sophie, are you home? Frank called through my door, his voice uncharacteristically friendly. I'm here to check your heating situation. I opened the door to find him carrying a toolbox and wearing work clothes, probably hoping to create evidence of maintenance activity for the inspector's benefit. The heating's been broken for 3 months, I said, stepping aside to let him enter my Arctic apartment. I have documentation of every repair request and your responses dismissing them. Frank's casual confidence wavered as he felt the frigid temperature and saw the space heaters I'd been using to prevent my pipes from freezing. This is just a minor adjustment issue, he said, fiddling with the thermostat that had been displaying error messages since October. I'll have it fixed in no time. Frank, the boiler hasn't worked properly since last winter. The heating system needs complete replacement, not minor adjustments. He ignored my assessment, probably hoping that superficial repairs would satisfy the housing inspector and allow him to continue collecting rent for substandard housing. The inspector arrived an hour later, accompanied by a city code enforcement officer who documented violations with the thoroughness of someone building a legal case. Miss Johnson, this apartment is currently 42 degrees, the inspector noted, checking her calibrated thermometer. The city's housing code requires minimum temperatures of 68 degrees during heating season. I've been documenting the temperature daily for 3 months, I replied, showing her my logs and photographs. The landlord has consistently refused to address the heating system failure. Frank hovered nervously as the inspection team documented multiple code violations, inadequate heating, broken windows, water damage, electrical problems, and structural issues that made the building unsafe and uninhabitable. Mr. Peterson, you'll receive citations for 12 housing code violations, the enforcement officer informed Frank. The building must be brought into compliance within 30 days or face legal action including potential condemnation. Frank's face went pale as he processed the financial implications of being forced to actually maintain his property according to legal standards. "Officer, there must be some misunderstanding," he began, probably hoping to negotiate his way out of accountability. "These are minor maintenance issues that I've been working to address. Mr. Peterson, we have documented evidence that tenants have been requesting these repairs for months without response. This isn't minor maintenance, this is systematic neglect of basic habitability requirements." After the inspection team left, Frank approached me with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Sophie, this inspection is going to cost me thousands of dollars in repairs," he said, apparently expecting sympathy from the tenant he'd been mistreating for months. "Can't we work something out? Maybe I could reduce your rent while I make improvements?" "Frank, you should have made these improvements when I first requested them in October," I replied. "Offering rent reductions now doesn't change the fact that you've been collecting money for uninhabitable housing for months." "What do you want from me?" he asked, his usual arrogance replaced by genuine concern about facing legal consequences for his neglect. "I want you to understand that tenants have rights. And landlords have responsibilities," I said, pulling out a folder I'd been preparing for this exact conversation. "I also want you to understand that violations of those rights have legal consequences." I handed him a copy of the lawsuit I'd filed against him for rent reimbursement, punitive damages, and legal fees related to his systematic violation of housing codes and tenant rights. "You're suing me?" he asked, staring at the legal documents. "I'm holding you accountable for collecting rent while knowingly providing uninhabitable housing," I corrected. "The lawsuit seeks reimbursement for rent paid during the period when heating was non-functional, plus damages for the health and safety risks you created by ignoring maintenance responsibilities." Frank's hands were shaking as he read through the comprehensive legal action that documented months of his neglect and its consequences. "Sophie, I can't afford a lawsuit right now," he said. "Between the code violations and legal fees, this could bankrupt me." "You should have considered that before deciding that tenant complaints weren't worth addressing," I replied. "Housing law exists to protect tenants from exactly the kind of neglect you've been practicing." The final revelation came when I pulled out the deed showing my recent purchase of the building through a foreclosure sale Frank hadn't been aware of. "Frank, there's one more thing you should know about the situation," I said, placing the property ownership documents on the table. "As of last week, I'm the new owner of 412 Maple Street." His face went through several color changes as he processed that the tenant he'd been mistreating for months had just become his boss through legal purchase of the property he'd been mismanaging. You bought the building?" he whispered. The most valuable outcome wasn't the financial recovery or even the improved living conditions. It was demonstrating that systematic documentation of landlord violations could lead to meaningful accountability and positive change for vulnerable tenants. "Sophie, your case has become a model for other tenant advocacy organizations," said Maria Santos from the citywide Tenants' Rights Coalition. "The comprehensive documentation you maintained and the legal strategies you used have helped other tenants hold negligent landlords accountable." The experience had transformed from personal hardship into professional expertise in tenant rights enforcement, helping other renters understand their legal protections and the importance of documenting violations when landlords refuse to maintain basic habitability standards. Sometimes the best response to landlord neglect isn't just surviving substandard conditions, but systematically building the legal case that forces accountability and creates better housing for everyone. Frank had dismissed tenant complaints because he believed renters had no power to enforce their rights. But proper documentation and legal action had proven him wrong while improving conditions for future tenants. The transformation of 412 Maple Street became a case study in tenant advocacy and responsible property management that attracted attention from housing policy researchers and legal aid organizations across the state. The systematic approach I'd used to document violations and pursue legal remedies became a template for other tenants facing similar exploitation. Sophie's methodology for building a comprehensive case against negligent landlords has been adopted by tenant organizations in 12 cities, noted Dr. Patricia Williams from the Housing Policy Institute during a conference on affordable housing advocacy. Her case demonstrates how proper documentation and legal strategy can transform individual tenant experiences into systematic change. The educational impact extended beyond individual tenant advocacy into broader policy discussions about housing code enforcement and landlord accountability measures that could protect vulnerable renters from systematic exploitation. The Frank Peterson case revealed gaps in our housing inspection protocols, admitted City Council member Robert Martinez during budget hearings for expanded code enforcement. Sophie's documentation showed that landlords were gaming the system by making temporary repairs only when inspections were scheduled, then reverting to negligent practices afterward. The policy changes that followed included surprise inspections, tenant protection measures for reporting violations, and increased penalties for repeated housing code violations that made slumlord business models financially unsustainable. 1 year after taking ownership of the building, I had converted it into a model of affordable housing that exceeded all habitability standards, while remaining accessible to tenants with modest incomes. The contrast with Frank's previous management style attracted attention from other property owners interested in responsible investment strategies. Your building has become an example of how property investment can be both profitable and ethical, said investor Michael Chun during a real estate development conference. The tenant satisfaction rates and low turnover costs demonstrate that maintaining proper housing standards actually improves long-term financial performance. The financial analysis revealed that Frank's false economy of deferred maintenance had actually cost more than proper upkeep would have required, while creating legal liabilities that ultimately led to foreclosure and bankruptcy. What's the most important lesson for other property owners? Asked conference moderator Sarah Thompson. That tenant rights enforcement benefits everyone in the housing market, I replied. When landlords are held accountable for providing habitable housing, it creates higher standards across the industry and protects ethical property owners from being undercut by slumlords, who cut corners on basic safety and maintenance. The most meaningful recognition came from tenant advocacy organizations that cited my case as proof that individual tenants could successfully challenge powerful landlords when armed with proper legal knowledge and systematic documentation. Sophie's victory over Frank Peterson demonstrated that tenant rights aren't just theoretical protections, they're enforceable legal standards that can be used to hold negligent landlords accountable, said Maria Santos during the annual Tenants' Rights Coalition meeting. 2 years after the initial heating crisis, I received an unexpected letter from Frank himself, who had moved to another state after declaring bankruptcy and losing his remaining rental properties to creditors. Sophie, I wanted to write and acknowledge that you were right about tenant rights and landlord responsibilities, his letter began. I spent years treating tenants poorly because I thought they had no power to hold me accountable. Your case taught me that documentation and legal knowledge can level the playing field between landlords and renters. His letter continued, I've been working for a property management company here in Arizona, and I've learned to address tenant concerns promptly and maintain properties according to code requirements. Facing the legal consequences of my previous behavior forced me to understand that responsible property management benefits everyone involved. The personal transformation was more than I'd expected from someone whose neglect had been so systematic and deliberate. What would you tell other landlords who are tempted to cut corners on maintenance and tenant services? I wrote back. That the short-term savings aren't worth the long-term legal and financial consequences, he replied. Proper maintenance costs less than emergency repairs, legal settlements, and foreclosure proceedings. More importantly, Treating tenants with respect creates better relationships and more stable rental income than exploitation and neglect. 3 years later, my building had become a training site for property management students learning about ethical landlord practices and tenant relations. The contrast between Frank's previous management style and current standards provided clear examples of how housing policies should be implemented. This building shows what's possible when property owners prioritize tenant welfare alongside financial returns, explained Professor Jennifer Walsh during a field trip with her property management class. Sophie's approach demonstrates that responsible ownership creates better outcomes for everyone involved. The students toured apartments that maintained comfortable temperatures year-round, examined maintenance systems that addressed problems promptly, and interviewed tenants who praised the responsive management style that had replaced Frank's negligent approach. "What was the key factor in transforming this property from slum to model housing?" asked one student. "Accountability," I replied. Frank's neglect was allowed to continue because tenants didn't understand their rights or know how to enforce them. Once proper legal pressure was applied, the cost of negligence became higher than the cost of responsible management. The most important outcome wasn't the improved living conditions, or even the legal precedent. It was proving that systematic documentation and legal advocacy could protect vulnerable tenants from exploitation while creating incentives for ethical property management across the housing market. Sometimes, the best response to landlord negligence isn't just enduring substandard conditions, but building the comprehensive legal case that forces accountability and improves housing standards for everyone. Frank had believed that tenants were powerless to challenge his authority, but proper documentation and legal action had transformed a freezing apartment into a catalyst for housing policy reform that protected countless other renters from similar exploitation. The young woman who'd shivered in a 40-degree apartment became an advocate whose legal victory improved housing conditions throughout the city, proving that individual tenant experiences could become the foundation for systematic change when supported by proper documentation and strategic legal action.